Ted, we might have lost you. Oh,
Are you there?
you were muted. Sorry about that. Yep.
Okay. All right. All right. So sorry. So basically, I'm just going to talk about how do we figure out what that 1% probability event is that in the National Flood Insurance Program we require communities to build at or above as their minimum standards. And as we talk out through some of this, you'll actually see that the 1% standard isn't enough in some places as well. And so how do we figure out how communities can basically build themselves so they're reasonably safe from flooding? So there's a few different types of situations that we deal with to try and figure out that 1% probability. There's going to be people who speak in more depth on the probability information, but I'll kind of talk through where we've done some of this data and where we found some of this data. Because in Alaska, we have some areas where we have a long, consistent data on ice jam flooding, but and also you're looking not just at ice jam flooding, but also regular riverine flooding, and which one is greater. So you have to kind of look at those things. And then, but in a lot of places we have very limited data. And so how do we work with communities in those situations? So I'm just going to go through a bunch of these. So this is a typical stage frequency curve that you can see for trying to figure out what the 1% probability is. And so what you're doing here, if you're not familiar, is let's say you have 50 years of record. You take your highest stage that you've ever seen, and you call it your 1 in 50 or 2% chance of occurring in any given year. And then you take your second highest, and it's 2 in 50, 1 in 25, and you plot that point, and you go all the way down. And the longer record you have, the better that curve is to basically project to what your 1 in 100 or 1% chance of occurring is. And so, so for Galena, and this was talked about earlier, is that's an area that actually sees ice jams on a regular basis. So there's a pretty consistent data set over time that you can kind of look at and do that statistical analysis and project to the 1 in 100 ice jam. And then you'll see there's the open water stage, and that's more of a riverine situation. And you can see that all those points are generally lower. And so essentially we're defining that 1% probability on the ice jams because that's kind of the defining 1% event for Galena. And so we had a big disaster there. Sorry. And so ultimately, and I think you've seen this picture too, but on the left is that Galena disaster. We figured out what that 1% probability event was. We then projected it on a map and showed where the flooding extents were. So you can both figure out where the high ground is, but also if you are going to build in those areas, to build above that flood elevation. So you can see on the right, the house that's being built above that flood elevation. And so there's other places where we have that information as well, but it can be a bit more limited. And again, you're kind of looking at the different frequencies of stage frequency and also flow frequency for your normal riverine flooding. And ultimately, in this case as well, the ice jams were the dominant flood source. And so we projected, and so in a lot of these communities in the lower Yukon, Kuskokwim area, there isn't a lot of high ground, to be honest. And so so I'm going to get into a little bit of well, so how do we kind of help them make decisions on where to build? So it may not be good enough just to build above the 100-year, because if, let's say, you have a 500-year event everything may be underwater and there's nowhere to go. And in some places that can be 50 miles away, that you have high ground. Um, so, so as an example of a place where we just don't have the data. So sometimes what you get is either there just isn't a gauge, or it doesn't happen, the flooding doesn't happen in a consistent place, or where the gauge is, it's hard to project to the location you're at. Or it's just an area that doesn't see ice jam flooding a lot, but when it does, it's something significant. So for McGrath, this is from the flood insurance study. The flood of record in McGrath was the result of ice jamming in the meander downstream of the community. And so anyway, it was surveyed by, I believe, the Corps to be at this 338 NAV 88 datum. So we have information here, but we don't have a frequency. We don't have enough data to be able to put it in context. So we kind of do a lot of consultation with the Corps, who has a lot more experience in what those ice jams are, both upstream and downstream, to try and give that particular flood context. And ultimately, we usually are looking at taking that flood of record, and depending on how many years that we think that flood is the flood of record for. So let's say you've had people there that can chronicle how high, and you think, yeah, that 1972 flood, there's no way that there was any flood before, since 1940 that has occurred above that. That kind of gives you a feel that, yeah, maybe this is at this point, a 1 in 80 year roughly, and then you kind of add a couple feet of freeboard for the great uncertainty you have. So the Corps has actually documented a lot of these past floods. They've gone to a lot of these communities and surveyed the high water marks. And so that has helped to provide information on where to build. And so it really does come down to, when we have this limited data, going to each community and really talking it out. And so what you see a lot of the times in these communities, in this Russian mission here, you can see, it's actually kind of hard to see a little bit, but the middle range is actually, I think, the flood of record. And then I think if you read up top, it actually has a higher one of, I think, 5 feet higher, that might be the standard project flood. And I can't actually speak to how that was determined, but what you see is it's about 4 or 5 feet higher. And so a lot of these communities down in this lower Yukon area actually have that as what they build their schools to, because that is the place that people go to if a big flood occurs, that they know is going to be above the flood. So again, they need somewhere to go when even greater than 100-year flood occurs, and you have that you know is going to be out of the floodplain, and there isn't high ground in those locations. So there's this kind of information on a lot of communities that the Corps has. Actually, here's the one with the standard. So you can see the 1963 flood, the 1967 flood. So again, we only have a couple data points, but then there's obviously been more regional analysis done to kind of figure out really how high is the highest flood that could really occur, and what should we build to. And so these markers, these rulers, are essentially put up in several places across the town, so people know, and they're surveyed in so people know how to build. Kwethluk is another example. Again, flood of record 95.5. So the recommended building elevation is 96.5. And so again, they decided, well, okay, the flood of record is 95.5, but that's probably not quite the 100-year. So let's put another foot for safety. And so then the elevation of the school, they decided to put, again, about 5 feet higher. And then it just gives some other key areas that they want to track what the flood elevation is that have been surveyed. Emmonak is similar. Again, school is at 8 feet. The high water mark, the highest high water mark is at that 4. Recommended building elevation is a foot higher. And again, you can find that both here and then in other parts of Emmonak. And so you can see the tanks up here built several feet, because obviously that's something that you don't want to have damage. So it's more than just a 1% event. So, and so that's basically from the highest event was the 1989 event at 19.4 feet. Okay, and I guess that was it. So really, I'm just trying to give you a snapshot of kind of the challenges we have in these areas where a lot of the time the data is relatively poor. And so it kind of comes to pulling your resources, talking to the communities, figuring out what the historical contexts are of these floods. And you're really doing it a lot more crudely than you are in a lot of other locations in the United States, because you just don't have as much data. So I don't know, Aaron.